In the heart of a bustling American city street, under the hum of traffic and watchful eyes of strangers, a quiet act of kindness sparked a storm no one saw coming. A young black woman noticed an elderly black Marine, weathered by time, ignored by the crowd, sitting alone with no food, no warmth, and only the weight of a forgotten legacy draped across his shoulders. With compassion in her heart, she removed her jacket and placed it gently over his back. But what should have been a moment of grace turned into a scene of injustice. 3 police officers, misjudging the moment, stormed in with fury, firing the woman on the spot, dragging her away, and striking the old man without hesitation. What they didn't know? The man they disrespected was not just a veteran, but a 4-star general and a billionaire. And what happens next would silence the city and shake the country to its core. The crowd that once only stared began to shift uneasily. Whispers turned into murmurs as the 3 officers manhandled the young woman, shoving her toward their cruiser. She didn't resist. Her eyes stayed fixed on the old Marine still sitting on the sidewalk, now clutching the jacket she had given him. One officer, face flushed with arrogance, barked at the man to stand. When he didn't respond quickly enough, the officer struck him across the face, hard. Gasps erupted from nearby onlookers. Some reached for their phones, some turned away in shame, others just froze. But the old Marine didn't flinch. He slowly turned his head, revealing a metal insignia beneath his jacket. One that hadn't been seen by many, because few ever reached the rank he had earned. Then came the roar of a high-end car engine. A black SUV with military plates pulled up and parked diagonally in the street, blocking traffic. The door opened, and out stepped a tall man in a custom suit. He spoke into a Bluetooth headset and strode toward the chaos. The police hesitated, confused, until he pulled out a government badge and snapped, "Step away from the general, now!" One of the officers scoffed. "He's just a homeless old—" "Wrong," the man said coldly. "That's General Elijah Ward, retired, decorated, owner of Ward Tactical Industries. Net worth $3.7 billion, and you just laid hands on him. And her?" He pointed at the trembling young woman in cuffs. "She just showed more honor than you've ever worn in uniform." Cameras were already rolling. A woman live-streamed the moment to social media. A man nearby whispered, "That's the guy from the Forbes list. No way." Suddenly, sirens blared again. But this time, it was internal affairs, city brass, and federal agents. In under 10 minutes, the scene transformed. The 3 police officers were put in cuffs. The young woman was uncuffed and wrapped in a warm blanket. The general stood on his own feet, eyes steady, voice calm. He looked at the crowd and said, "I've fought for this country, and I've seen enemies in every uniform. But today I saw one of our finest, not in rank but in heart." He pointed to the young woman. She didn't see a beggar. She saw a brother. And the moment she gave me that jacket, she reminded me why I served. Not for medals, not for money, but for people like her. That moment went viral. The next day, the young woman was offered a National Humanitarian Award. General Ward donated $10 million to establish the Honor First Foundation, helping veterans in need and training police in empathy and accountability. But more than that, the story reminded the nation. Sometimes the richest hearts wear the simplest clothes. And justice, though late, always finds its way when honor stands up, even on the coldest streets. As the dust settled and the crowd parted, news crews flooded the scene. Microphones were thrust forward, lights turned on, and headlines were already being written. But General Elijah Ward wasn't interested in the cameras. He walked slowly to the young woman whose eyes welled with tears, not of fear, but of exhaustion and quiet dignity. She had only done what felt right. She didn't expect thanks. She certainly didn't expect this. The general extended his hand, firm and steady, and said, "What's your name?" She wiped her cheek and replied softly, "Alicia. Alicia Brooks." He nodded. Alicia, today, you reminded a soldier why his fight still matters. You didn't hesitate. Even when no one else did anything, you stood up. I'd like you to work with me. She blinked. Work with you? Doing what? Running a national program for vets, he said. Food, clothing, job placement, real support, not charity, dignity. You've got heart. That's what we need leading change. The officers who had assaulted them were now seated in the back of a federal vehicle, their badges already suspended pending investigation. People who had once looked away when the old man sat alone were now stepping forward, some crying, some apologizing. An elderly couple offered Alicia a place to stay. A young man pulled off his hoodie and gave it to a shivering veteran nearby. The entire block felt different, like a stone had been lifted from its chest. By sunset, Alicia was trending on every platform. Honor with heart. Thousands of veterans commented, many sharing their own stories of being overlooked. Thousands more offered donations. The story hit the morning news across the globe. But Alicia didn't care about the fame. She sat next to General Ward that evening in his private rooftop garden overlooking the city. They shared a quiet meal, nothing fancy. Just 2 plates of warm food and a deep silence between them. After a while, he spoke. You know what I learned today? He asked. She looked at him. What's that? That real strength doesn't wear a uniform or carry a rank, he said. It shows up in the moment when no one's watching, and does the right thing anyway. Alicia smiled, tears now falling freely. I just couldn't watch them ignore you like that. And because you didn't, he said, the whole world stopped and listened. Later that week, Alicia stood on the stage of the Lincoln Memorial, invited to speak at a nationwide event. She stood not as a celebrity, not as a victim, but as a leader, an example of what it means to act with compassion, even when it costs you everything. Her voice echoed through the National Mall. Sometimes the world needs reminding that kindness is louder than hate, and that no man's honor should ever be judged by the clothes on his back, but by the heart he carries. And behind her stood General Elijah Ward, saluting, not as a billionaire, not as a general, but as a man proud to follow her lead. The nation would remember that day, not because of the outrage, but because of the light one young woman chose to be when the world tried to stay in the dark. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of Alicia's act of courage reached every corner of the country. Major news outlets featured in-depth segments, not just on the incident, but on the broader crisis facing America's veterans, the ones who came home to no parades, no pensions, and no place to sleep. Interviews poured in, talk shows, political roundtables, and even late-night hosts wanted a piece of the story. But Alicia stayed grounded. She turned down every reality deal, every fashion brand endorsement, every shallow offer. Instead, she focused on building what the general called Operation Second Salute. It began modestly, a converted community center in the heart of a struggling neighborhood. But the mission was massive. Help forgotten heroes rise again. Meals were served daily. Volunteers showed up in droves. Medical staff, legal advisors, job trainers, all gave their time. Alicia, now the director, showed up first and left last. She hugged the broken. She listened to their pain. And when donors visited expecting to meet a polished executive, they found her scrubbing the floors in sneakers, laughing with veterans over peanut butter sandwiches. Meanwhile, General Ward, no longer just a name on business magazines, put his entire weight behind the cause. He sold off one of his companies and poured the earnings into a national initiative. With Alicia by his side, they launched veteran housing projects in 10 states, lobbied Congress for policy change, and even partnered with Fortune 500 companies to guarantee job placement for thousands of servicemen and women. But something deeper changed too. Police departments across the country began inviting Alicia and General Ward to speak at trainings. What started as resistance turned into reflection. One officer who had once dismissed the story said, "I used to think people like him were just part of the past, until I realized I was looking right through living history." And for Alicia, the journey came full circle one quiet morning in spring. She walked down that same city street where it all began. It looked different now, cleaner, safer. On the very spot where the confrontation had erupted, a bronze statue now stood, of an elderly Marine seated with quiet pride, and beside him, a young woman placing a jacket over his shoulders. The plaque read, "One act of kindness awakened a nation," in honor of General Elijah Ward and Alicia Brooks, for showing us what it truly means to serve. Alicia stood silently before the statue. She ran her fingers across the letters. Behind her, a group of elementary school children walked by, their teacher pointing to the monument. "That's her," a little girl whispered. "That's the lady from the story." Alicia turned, smiled, and knelt down. "You know," she told the girl, "you don't need a badge or $1 billion to make a difference. You just need a heart brave enough to see someone and strong enough to help." And with that, she stood, took a deep breath, and walked forward. Because while the world would always remember the billionaire general and the moment injustice was exposed, what truly endured was the legacy of a young woman who simply refused to look away and ended up giving a nation back its conscience. As Alicia walked away from the statue, the spring breeze brushing through her hair, she didn't realize that another crowd had begun forming, not out of spectacle, but out of quiet reverence. Veterans, young and old, some in wheelchairs, others, with canes or faded uniforms, had gathered for the unveiling. Many of them had traveled across states just to stand on that street, to stand where a jacket became a symbol of dignity, and where a woman with no badge, no rank, and no obligation reminded America what honor looks like. One elderly veteran stepped forward, his eyes misty, his voice cracking. "They left us on sidewalks like ghosts. But you saw us, Miss Brooks. You gave us back our name." Alicia held his hand, nodded gently, and replied, "You never lost it. The world just stopped." Looking, General Ward, now walking with a refined cane but the same sharp gaze, approached and stood beside her. He looked out over the crowd and said, "Today isn't about a statue. It's about a mirror. This country needs to look at itself and ask, are we proud of what we've become? Or do we still have the courage to change?" That message echoed across the media, in headlines and speeches, even reaching the White House. Soon, a federal resolution was introduced and passed. The Ward-Brooks Act, establishing new protections for veterans, stricter accountability for police misconduct against vulnerable populations, and funding for community-led outreach efforts nationwide. But perhaps the most powerful change happened quietly, within the hearts of everyday people. Restaurants began reserving tables for veterans with plaques that read, "You are never forgotten." Schools incorporated Alicia's story into history lessons. Police academies added empathy training as part of their core curriculum. And across social media, thousands shared the hashtag, "A Jacket of Honor," using it to highlight everyday acts of compassion and bravery. Alicia's days remained busy. She never moved to a mansion. She lived in the same modest apartment, often walking to work, always carrying an extra jacket in her bag, just in case she saw someone who needed it. She believed in showing up, not showing off. In one interview, when asked how she stayed so grounded amid national fame, she simply said, "Because the day I forget why I started is the day I stop being useful." Years passed. Her hair grew streaks of silver, and she carried a quiet wisdom with her everywhere. General Ward eventually passed away, but not before establishing a foundation in her name. In his final public letter, he wrote, "America knew me as a general, but the day I met Alicia Brooks, I became a soldier again, this time in a different kind of war, the war for dignity, justice, and truth. And if you're reading this, join her. Because she's not finished, and neither are we. At his funeral, a nation mourned. But it didn't grieve like before, it honored. Tens of thousands gathered not just for a flag-draped casket, but for a life that sparked a movement. Alicia, now seen as the nation's moral compass, gave the final words. We lost a warrior, but he didn't just fight battles. He fought silence and ignorance and apathy. And he won. Because we're still here, still standing, and still seeing those who were once invisible. And in the crowd that day stood a new generation of leaders, young women and men who had been inspired by her courage. Many of them had grown up with her story. Some were veterans, some were police, some were just citizens. But all of them understood now deeply what one jacket, one act, and one voice could do. So, when people asked years later, what changed? The country? The answer came in whispers, in textbooks, in murals, and in hearts. Alicia Brooks gave a jacket. America gave her its soul back. The years flowed on, but the story of Alicia Brooks became etched into the cultural memory of the nation, not as a passing headline, but as a turning point. Universities held symposiums named in her honor, titled The Brooks Principle, Courage in the Face of Comfort. Her name became shorthand for moral clarity. Civic leaders often invoked her legacy when shaping policy. Let's make a decision. Alicia would be proud of, they'd say in closed chambers. It wasn't about celebrity, it was about compass. By the 10th anniversary of the Jacket Day, as it came to be called, cities across the country commemorated it with service drives. Volunteers passed out jackets to the homeless, schools hosted veterans to speak to children, and local governments held free legal clinics for struggling ex-military families. But at the center of it all, Alicia still kept her role humble, refusing to be the keynote speaker, opting instead to work the crowd, pour coffee, hand out jackets, and listen, always listening. One day, while visiting a small town in Georgia to check on one of the newest Second Salute centers, Alicia noticed a teenage boy sitting alone on a bench. He wore tattered shoes and had the hollow look of someone who had learned to expect disappointment. She sat beside him and asked his name. Marcus, he said without looking up. My dad was a Marine. Got kicked out because he got hurt. Mom's sick. Nobody cares. Doesn't matter. Alicia didn't say much. She simply took off her scarf, wool, warm, wrapped in memories, and placed it gently over his shoulders. It matters to me, she said, and to a man named Elijah Ward, who once sat where you are now. That small act lit a spark. The center enrolled Marcus in mentorship programs. Volunteers helped his mother with medical treatment. 3 years later, Marcus graduated high school with honors and gave a speech at a national veterans fundraiser. In it, he said, I once believed nobody saw me, but a woman named Alicia did. She didn't save me with money or magic, just a scarf, a smile, and the truth that I mattered. That's all I needed to start believing in tomorrow. Stories like Marcus's weren't rare anymore. Across America, veterans found new purpose, and young people found role models in unexpected places. Alicia's story had planted millions of seeds, and each act of kindness it inspired became part of a vast, growing forest of change. As for Alicia, her hair now fully silver, she remained the soul of the movement. She never ran for office, never took titles, but she was often invited to quietly counsel leaders behind the scenes, mayors, governors, even presidents. They didn't bring her in for sound bites. They brought her in for wisdom. One winter evening, she sat once more beneath the statue on that same city street, watching snow fall gently over the bronze likeness of her younger self. A young mother passed by and stopped. Her little girl stared at the monument and asked, Mommy, who is that lady? The mother smiled, kneeling down. That's Alicia Brooks. She changed the world with a jacket. And Alicia, seated on a nearby bench with her scarf tucked around her neck, heard the words and chuckled softly. Not because she was proud. not because she sought legacy, but because, in that quiet moment, she knew. Her mission had worked. The world no longer needed to remember her name, because it had remembered its heart. As the snowflakes fell silently, covering the sidewalks and statues like a blanket of grace, Alicia remained seated, watching the world go by. Not needing to be noticed, only grateful it was moving in the right direction. She smiled at the mother and daughter, gave a gentle nod, then rose to her feet with the slow, dignified strength of someone who had carried both pain and progress on her shoulders. She walked down the street alone, as she had done so many times before, not to applause, not to fanfare, but to continue her quiet work. Along the way, she passed others in need, and as always, she noticed them. She stopped, she listened, she offered kindness. And with each step, the world became a little softer, a little stronger, a little more human. Later that evening, a candlelight vigil was held at the monument, not just for General Ward, but for every nameless veteran who was ever overlooked, for every soul who had been seen because one woman chose to care. Hundreds gathered, holding candles that flickered in the winter. The words of the original plaque had been updated for the anniversary. One act of courage, one heart of honor. A jacket started it, but love carried it home. The crowd fell into a deep silence, not because someone told them to, but because they understood. And as Alicia stood quietly behind the crowd, unnoticed once again, she whispered to herself, "Let the world keep changing. Just don't let it forget why it started. They thought he was just an old man. They thought she was just a waitress. They were both wrong, and the world would never be the same again. One jacket, one stand, one legacy that woke a nation. Remember her name. Or don't. Just remember to see the invisible."